I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're about to hear a chapter of my ongoing sword and sorcery serial. It's written to be heard, not read, and there's no music, sound effects, or character actors. It's all me, and I do it in one single, flawless take. We pick up right where we left off last time, so if this is your first episode, you might consider going back to check out some of the previous ones first. But there's nothing wrong with jumping right into the deep end either. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 22. The door had stood for generations, for millennia, for ages, guarding the inhabitants of that solitary tower. But now, that ancient door, made of some knotted and worn timber cut from some forgotten species, it shook wildly within its frame. It trembled as the trolls assailed it with an unquenchable thirst for destruction, an undeniable urge to tear down and destroy that which they were incapable of building themselves. She stood and she watched, fists clenched, as the trolls and their assault caused the door to rattle on its hinges. The metal bar still held, but as she watched, she could see that thick beam start to bend slightly with every new volley. Though her mortal enemies were mere yards away, though she could hear their nonsensical grunts and squeals, though she could see the door shake and could have sworn she heard a distinct cracking and splintering, she was not afraid. If it was later in the evening, further along in that interminable 20-hour night, she would have simply waited it out. The trolls had tried to break through the door before, and they had failed, slinking back to their caves as the night came to a close. But it was still far too early in this particular night, too early to simply cower, wait, and hope for the salvation of the sun. No. She would have to take action, to take fate in her own hands, and squeeze it with a grip that would last until death. Possibly even longer. But what action could she take? How many 20-hour nights could she endure with that endless assault on the tower? How many inverted days could she suffer through, stealing measly 4-hour naps in the faltering daylight? How much more could the door take? How much more could the tower withstand? How much could she withstand? And perhaps most importantly, what was the point of it all? On a long enough timeline, the door would splinter and it would break. The trolls would rush in. They would use their thick, brutish hands to break whatever they failed to understand, which was everything. They would smash everything they found, never stopping to question what it was, why it existed, or even how they might make use of it. They would tear into the tower itself, ripping the blocks from the walls until it all came tumbling down on their foolish heads. And if she was lucky, they would kill her first, so that she wasn't left to watch her mission, her life's purpose, reduced to more useless rubble in the meaningless tundra of this forsaken realm. And if somehow, miraculously, she was able to fulfill her mission, able to protect the tower and the secrets it contained, the eldritch wisdom of those that had come before. If she was able to survive, to hold on, to continue fighting off the trolls until she reached old age and died, secure in the knowledge that if absolutely nothing else, she had done her best. What then? She knew exactly what. She would look on from whatever heaven or hell she had earned for herself as the trolls, those mindless automatons, those imbecilic lemmings went about doing exactly what they wanted, what they were destined to do, her best efforts and intentions be damned. These grim, Fatalistic thoughts bounced around in her brain as she listened to the trolls banging on the door. She turned her gaze to the pot full of hungry flames, the one that still hung above the brazier in the center of the room. What's the point? What's the point? She mumbled as she took a ladle and scooped up the wild, riotous, flaming liquid. Then she spoke again. There is no point. And then dumped the blazing liquid down her gullet. She tried to cry out, but her voice wouldn't come as it was burned and scalded into submission by that viscous, magical concoction, the one that now sloshed around in her stomach, setting her entire being ablaze. She fell to the ground, curling up around the flames as they consumed her, their merciless roar melding with the sound of the trolls, the ones for whom mindless, pointless destruction was their only goal, their only motivating factor. With the flames still roiling, both within and without, she dragged herself toward the door. Grasping that metal beam, the one that shook and rattled every time the trolls smashed senselessly into the door, she pulled herself up. She fought to her feet, though the pain was excruciating, and she felt as if her belly was full of hot coals. No point. No point. No point. She muttered to herself, half crazed as she lifted the heavy metal beam, casting it aside, removing one of the very few barriers that lay between her and the horde of idiotic monsters that would do anything to break through. As the coals in her stomach ignited everything they touched, causing the liquid fire to climb back up her throat, she grasped the heavy handle of the door, that ancient, enchanted portal, and she flung it open. She knew what she would find. She had seen the trolls before, their horrible faces twisted into ghastly expressions as they were lit up by her cleansing fire. But though she had seen them up close a dozen times before, she was never truly prepared to gaze into those glowing green eyes, glazed over with nescient hate. The eyes sat inside faces that were like those of a human, but twisted, bulbous, and asymmetrical. They were hideous, disgusting to look at, but the most offensive part? It was the ignorance they wore proudly across their dim-witted faces, as a general might display a sign of rank, or a warrior might show off a scar. They knew the raw power of their stupidity, and they reveled in it. The door swinging open had shocked the dim-witted beasts into silence and immobility. So when she looked out at their lumpen, puffy forms, she had a brief moment to take it all in. Could they speak? Could they understand? Maybe there was a way to reach them, to explain to them, to show them that there was another way, a better way. But after pondering for an exceptionally brief moment, she was harshly confronted with the answer. No. After a mere second of slack-jawed staring, a look of fury began to wash over the trolls' faces, the fury of one who does not and cannot understand, but tells himself it's a choice to not understand. The trolls, filling the area outside the door and swelling in numbers even as she watched, were consumed with the rage of the fool, the one who sees wisdom as an affront to their very existence. They sickened her. They were everything she hated, everything this tower stood to guard against. Her stomach pumped out bile at the sight of them, and it mixed with the liquid fire climbing up her throat. What was the point? What was the point? What was the point? She let out a furious scream as the toxic fire erupted from her throat, bursting out of her open mouth in an explosion of all-consuming flame. The fire wrapped itself around the trolls, who in their ill-advised attempts to flee only managed to ignite their brethren, filling the hallway and spiraling staircase with the putrid smell of burning hair and melting flesh. She wished she could stand and watch, to take pleasure in their suffering, a knowing sadism that their simple minds could never comprehend. But the risk was too great. A flaming troll inside her chambers would be too much for even her to contend with. So she slammed the door shut, replacing the metal beam before buckling at the waist and falling to her knees. Her stomach convulsed and her chest heaved as she coughed up what little remained in her stomach. She was fortunate. She had managed to expel all the fire from her gut. That wasn't always the case. So all she coughed up were bits of dried ham and thick, hot, bubbling blood that splattered on the floor, mixing with the foul ooze that seeped under the door, the rancid remains of what had been burned off the trolls by that unforgiving flame. She struggled to stop coughing as she realized that her desperate stratagem was one that she would pay for by hacking up boiling blood throughout the next day. Despite that grim realization, however, she managed to force herself to her feet. If she would indeed suffer the following day, then she would do her damnedest to make the trolls, the ones still encircling the tower, suffer now. The towering stone god lumbered and lurched as it climbed the hill toward Maul. It was getting dark quickly, with the bizarre realm's twin suns having just lowered behind the horizon. But Maul could see the giant's entire outline. Broad chest, massive arms, legs like tree trunks, and a mouth that glowed with angry, red fire. He could also see that this god was past just wishing away, was far past Xylan's tricks, the ones that had so recently failed Maul. The savage, shoulders hunched, teeth clenched, knew that he couldn't beat this god with his mind. So he would do it his way, the best way, the way that always worked. He didn't know what the god was or from whence it came, but he knew that he would beat him. He would beat the god into shattered rubble that littered the landscape. He would beat him with the notched cudgel that he clenched in his steady, unshaking fist. Maul roared and he charged, not so much running as launching himself, forcing his heavily muscled frame off the ground and recklessly toward the massive stone god. The one that moved ever closer, climbing that hill in fits and starts upon its worn wooden wheels. Maul hadn't formed a plan. Plans were for cowards who thought that they might lose. Maul was a man who knew that he must win. So when he saw that the stone god was more stone and less god, built upon a heavy wooden cart pushed by a swarm of scowling halflings, it changed nothing. In fact, Maul began to laugh as his head filled with visions of tiny arms and legs, quivering as the bodies to which they were attached were crushed utterly beneath the god they worshipped. But Maul's foray into irony was as short-lived as his valiant charge, which was cut off by a frightful rumbling coming from within the stone god. Maul slowed briefly to assess this new threat, stopping just in time to see the monolithic guardian's glowing red mouth erupt with flame. Maul and Skog, who had been following behind him, as faithful as ever, leapt wildly to the side, narrowly escaping the column of flame that the stone god emitted, a powerful burst of fiery hell that scorched the ground they had stood upon, vaporizing grass, rocks, and the very dirt of the earth in its nightmarish blaze. The savage brute hopped back to his feet as quickly as possible, but breathed a sigh of relief as he saw that the halflings that had wheeled the stone god into position, clothed in furs and crude leathers, now scrambled up upon the stone god, desperately trying to fill its mouth with whatever uncanny catalyst had caused that awesome, searing blast. Maybe there was something to what the monk had said. This was a man-made god, built from dried mud and rock, whose only real power came from the tiny, frantic hands that now attempted to scale the very god they had built up. Maul didn't need to break this god, because this god wasn't real. All he had to do was knock it over and beat the breath from its followers, who now emerged from the bushes, wielding slings, wooden spears, and crude iron swords. Maul looked around, grinning as the savage, waist-high halflings swelled in numbers, surrounding both he and Skog. "Stand down, you foolish little beasts. I am not some traveler for you to feed to your idol. I am a king." But in response, the halflings, their faces painted garishly, their tiny teeth filed to vicious points, they simply lowered their weapons and continued closing in on the two murderous companions. Maul had warned them once, positively generous by his standards, especially considering the blood that streamed down his body, running over his elk leather armor, left in tatters by the halflings' expertly swung stones. In fact, it was even more generous, considering that though their numbers were large and still growing, this tribe, while savage, was still a halfling tribe. So with neither a second thought nor a regret between them, Maul and Skog dove into the frothing mass of halflings. Maul hit first, but he didn't use any calculated battle maneuvers. No, he simply laughed and cackled as he swung his arms and legs, sending tiny, furious bodies flying as he did. With one hand, he wielded his cudgel, urged on by the sickening crunch it made whenever it connected, and with the other, he wielded one of the very halflings he fought, swinging the squealing little beast to and fro. He swung the dying creature until the blood and sweat on its limbs made it impossible to hang on to, at which point he would let it loose and simply grab another. Skog, though she had no malice toward the halflings, or against anyone outside of his supplicants, was no less brutal in her assault. But unlike the other countless battles she had been in, this fight wasn't about crushing a finite amount of foes utterly and then celebrating your victory. No, this fight was against a massive, unending horde. It wasn't a fight for victory at all. It was a fight for survival. So the cat struggled against her instincts. Instead of going for death blows, she aimed simply to incapacitate as many halflings as possible, as quickly as she could, knocking as many as 4 halflings aside in a single swipe of her massive paws. As the halflings scrambled upon their god, attempting to place their diabolic substance in his mouth, so they scrambled upon Maul, attempting to place their tiny swords in his throat. But though the halflings continued to swarm over him and Skog, Maul just laughed, his bloodlust fueling his maniacal glee as he snatched halfling after halfling and flung them away from him, at other halflings, at the stout trees of that ancient forest, and at the stone god itself. The stone god. As Maul sent a screeching halfling hurtling toward it, he noticed that the stone god's attendants were starting to leap off the rumbling homunculus, while the halflings below began to wheel the cart around, repositioning so that their stone god looked down upon the cat beast, Skog. Grabbing another halfling, seizing the squawking little monster by the throat as he climbed up his body, Maul began to run. He kicked halflings aside and launched himself towards Skog, who was so busy tearing into the halflings surrounding her, she didn't notice the trembling god that loomed over her. Still clutching the halfling, the one that gasped and clawed at Maul's hand, the bleeding, wild-eyed brute ran harder as the stone god began to roar louder, shaking and rumbling as the halflings, who knew the word of their god all too well, began to scramble out of the way, clearing a path for their deity's infernal judgment. But Skog was still unaware, caught in her own bloodlust, with her back turned to the stone god as that fiendish flame erupted from its mouth. As Skog fought on, shaking an unlucky halfling in her jaw, Maul screamed and leapt forward, placing himself between Skog and the all-consuming, merciless blaze that reached out toward her. Maul landed and turned to face the flame, then lifted the snarling halfling and his cudgel both, a futile effort to shield himself from the ravenous liquid flame that surrounded him. The High Elf war priests were horrified, disgusted, and shamed by what they had unleashed on that nameless city. They had no real control over that thing, the Feldrun. But they did need to stay near it, close enough for the gnome's devices to pick up its movements and send them hurtling back through the void to their queen. So they had rushed behind it, that thing, refusing to look up at it for fear that by looking at it, they would somehow draw its attention, its awful, horrible, vile attention down upon themselves. Instead, they busied themselves with their devices, monitoring them, pretending to check up on the arcane machinery that they couldn't even comprehend. They navigated by sound alone, rushing along in the wake of the horrible, gurgling screams that died in the throat of all those that suffered the Feldrun's gaze. The war priest rushed along, through the nameless city's alleys, ghettos, and marketplaces. But where there used to be crime, misery, business, laughter, joy, and pain, now there was only death, destruction, and the stench of decay that assaulted their senses, no matter how much they tried to cover up their faces. They followed the Feldrun, who had seized upon Maul's scent and wouldn't give it up until the savage beast was found and his unspeakable agony broadcast back to Queen Enlith. Everything between now and then was nothing more than collateral damage. It had to be done. Or at least that's what the war priests told themselves as they struggled to block out the death rattles of people, of societies, of cultures, of an entire city. What was once a city with no name was now nothing at all. Amidst the crumbled and somehow already moldering ruins of that once bustling metropolis, the Feldrun stopped, and thus so did the war priests. The Feldrun buried its face in the dirt, snuffling with what passed for its nose, doing its best to dig out Maul's scent. Maul had left the city by magical means, traveling along the green passages of the Farah, so the Feldrun had to dig deep to find its path. But that monstrous, horrible heap had been created for one purpose and lived its miserable life solely to perform it, so it dug as deep as it needed to. And it found its trail. With a resigned groan, the Feldrun set off in its horrible, loping gait, galloping off into the wilderness. And as the war priests did their best to keep up, struggling not to listen, they couldn't help but hear as the Feldrun issued apology after horrible, tearful apology. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. If you're digging SKALD, please leave the show a good review. It's free, easy, and it helps get more eyes on the show. Plus, if you leave a good one, I'll read it on an upcoming episode. My first ever Patreon supporter, Matt Ballard, going by Nerd Unfiltered, says, Aubrey's masterful storytelling each and every week chronicles the tale of Maul, a powerful warrior and king by birthright. The story grabs you right from the start, and each episode leaves you craving the next. The most impressive thing about this show is Aubrey's not reading you a story, he's telling you a story in a single, magnificent, flawless take. 5 out of 5 stars. I can't recommend SKALD enough. Come find me online. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they're all Aubrey Sitterson. Or just head over to aubreySitterson.com, where I have links to everything, including SKALD, my comics writing work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. Reviews are super helpful, but the best way to support the show is by pledging a small monthly donation over at patreon.com/SKALD. Pledge $6 or more each month, and you'll get a free digital download of all upcoming SKALD ebooks. Speaking of which, SKALD Volume 1, The One True King of Men, is still available exclusively on Amazon. Find a direct link down in the description below. Time for a recommendation. I just finished reading Chapter House Dune. It was kind of an arduous task, but the difficulty of the 6th Dune novel should not deter you in any way from diving into the first book in the series. Dune is a tremendous achievement, and Herbert's willingness to delve into heavy Byzantine metaphor is a big influence on what I'm trying to do with SKALD. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.